Hello, 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 and welcome back to IVF in Your Pocket, your waiting room companion. In today's episode, I'm going to go over all the IVF tests that are out there. I'm going to start by going through the standard testing usually done before a retrieval, and then I'm going to continue on to talk about some tests that are done pre-transfer. A couple notes about this episode. Of course, as you all know, I'm not a medical professional. And then the other one is that some of these tests are a bit controversial. So different REs think different things about some of these tests, and I'll highlight those as we go through them. That is probably particularly true if you're outside of the United States. But either way, each of these tests, you'll want to get feedback and an opinion on from your care team and your RE. Your RE will likely have thoughts about these tests, and some clinics don't even do these tests. So I just wanted to do an episode so that there's an understanding of what all is out there. And then if anything is of particular interest to you and you hadn't heard of it, that's a good thing to talk to your care team about or do a little bit more research on. And then the other thing to know is this episode doesn't include immunology testing at all, because that's a whole nother episode. So before retrieval, there is almost always, this is really standard, a ton of blood work to look at the hormones and then a semen analysis. And those are pretty typical testing done before you even start a retrieval. There's also an ultrasound, and sometimes that can be what's called a saline ultrasound. Sometimes that is actually done between retrieval and transfer, and sometimes it's done before retrieval, or sometimes both. But there is some kind of ultrasound. And then if there's a question about blocked fallopian tubes, something called an HSG, which kind of looks and floods the fallopian tubes and see that they're open. Also, pretty standard in most U.S. clinics, fertility clinics, is a sexually transmitted infection panel, and sometimes it's strongly recommended and sometimes required to do some genetic screening of you and your partner. Of course, this is if you're going through the retrieval yourself and you're hoping to use your own eggs and or own sperm. And then, of course, there is the retrieval and the monitoring and blood work that comes along with the retrieval process, which I've discussed a little bit in some of the previous episodes. So if you want to learn more about that, take a look at those. And then there are a number of tests that one can do between retrieval and transfer, both if you yourself are going to be doing the transfer, you have a surrogate doing the transfer. And a really important one, some of these actually, I'll just say, some of these tests aren't even discussed really if you're new to IVF or you're in the first round of IVF. Sometimes your care team or your RE will fall back on these tests after there's been an embryo that has failed to implant or a chemical pregnancy, early pregnancy loss. And so I think it's really good to go in informed about what's out there. So a really big one is something called a CD138. And that's looking for inflammation in the endometrial lining, something called endometriotitis. Hope I'm pronouncing that right. Not to be confused with endometriosis. There is also really the most definitive test for endometriosis, where uterine lining can grow outside of the uterus and be very painful or not painful at all. You can be having endometriosis and not even know it. A lap procedure is good for endometriosis as a definitive test. This CD138 is not for endometriosis. It's for another kind of inflammation of the endometrial lining. Now, this one is a bit, I wouldn't say controversial, but sometimes REs are now Some REs are wanting to do something called the Emma and Alice to look for endometriotitis or the inflammation of the endometrium. And I believe those are newer tests. And some REs, at least here in the Bay Area, have some feelings about them. They don't feel like they're as thorough as a typical CD138, which is a kind of test that has been around longer. And so, just to recap, you can ask your care team about either a CD138 or an Emma Alice. Those are tests that can check the endometrium lining, and or possibly both, depending what your care team does and or thinks is effective. If you are concerned about something like endometriosis, that is something that is definitively diagnosed with a lap procedure, which is a larger surgery. So that's not something to take lightly. Sometimes endometriosis can be found, like stage 4 can be found on ultrasound, but it's MRI, but it's less likely, MRI, not ultrasound. So if you think you might have endometriosis, that's something to really take up with both your OB and your RE, and a definitive diagnosis for that is something like a lap surgery, where you do have to go in and look at the uterus and the uterine lining and ovaries. But you also want to make sure that you're getting checked if you're interested in the CD138, the Emma Alice. Now, a highlight here around a test that I feel like might be one of the more controversial tests, but I'm going to have to name it because it's something out there. It's called an ERA, and it's a newer test. And basically, my understanding of it is you have to do a mock transfer cycle, so it's quite extensive. You have to take a whole cycle to do what you would do for your actual cycle, and then there's a test at the end of that that is determining when the best timing is for transfer, down to the exact day. And some REs do this ERA test, and some do not. My understanding is that a lot of the Bay Area REs and clinics now aren't doing ERA as much. They just don't think it's very helpful. So that's just something to know, but that is out there. It's supposed to be a test that helps determine the best day for transfer for successful implantation of the embryo. And so those were a lot of tests I just threw at you. Just to recap, there's the CD138, which is an endometrial lining test to make sure there's not an infection or inflammation there. There is a much more intensive lap surgery, a definitive test for endometriosis. There is the Emma Alice, which is a kind of another test to test the endometrium lining. That's, I believe, a newer test. And then there's an ERA, which is a test that's done to really understand the optimal time for transfer. That also is a newer test that some clinics and some REs may not even offer, and honestly some REs might even kind of roll their eyes at that test. So some of these tests, they're out there. I want you to have all the information of what's out there. You can do more research on each specific test to see if that's something that you're interested in, and of course getting the opinion of your care team. Another test that's not as controversial at all, and an important one for checking the uterine lining more thoroughly, is called a hysteroscopy, and that goes into the uterus with a camera to look for fibroids. This is a test that I believe most REs are really in support of. Another test that is considered is something called a sperm fragmentation test that really looks more closely at the sperm for any kind of missing pieces there. And that can actually be done before retrieval as well, but it's usually your care team starts to look at that post-retrieval if there's been a pregnancy loss, but it's something that you can look into even before retrieval and before transfer. And then one that isn't talked about a lot, but I think that's really important to know that it's out there, is it's a blood draw series of tests called the Repeated Pregnancy Loss Panel Series of Blood Work. And it's for short called RPL tests. And this one is definitely usually run after there's been some kind of loss. Why it's run after loss, I don't know. And so I really want to put an asterisk next to these series of tests. I think there are like 3 or 4 that are testing like blood clotting. And they're just really important tests to know that's out there. And you may decide that you just want to go ahead with an RPL test, this is blood test, to see what is found there even before you do your first transfer. Or you may wait, or you may not do it at all. But it's something to really know that is an option. It's called an RPL, Repeated Pregnancy Loss Blood Panel, looking at clotting issues. So those are some of the tests that are out there. These are the main tests. Each of them are really important and good to do your own individual research on for yourself, and if you're on the journey with a partner, you and your partner, but also really important to take this information back to your care team and see what they say. And you've picked your provider because you trust them, and so you really want to take in their medical expertise on these tests. That concludes our episode for today. I'd love to hear from you. You can find me on alexandrapsychotherapy.com or on my email, alexandrapsychotherapy@gmail.com. You can find a way to contact me in the show notes if you'd like to work with me and you're in California. And I want to hear from you, like anything I missed today. Like maybe there's a new test out there that I don't know about that people coming into my private practice office don't know about. I would love to hear what you know. So please reach out for anything I missed today. Thank you so much for listening. And as always, remember, you are not alone.